There is a particular kind of silence that happens when an entire room realizes, at the same moment, that it has been wrong about something for a very long time. And I have felt it exactly once, in the third auditor's gallery of Threshold Accord Station, on what began as a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. My name is Vel Ashra. I am Andrai. You can picture us as roughly waist-high, four-eyed, our carapace translucent enough that junior recorders like myself are taught to sit very still in bright light, because otherwise the delegates behind us can see our hearts jump. We come from a homeworld with one of the lowest threat indices on file in the entire concordance registry. No apex predators, no serious tectonic activity, nothing that ever demanded much of us except patience and good penmanship. I have been a junior recorder at Threshold Accord Station for 6 years. My job, in its entirety, is to make sure nothing said in a concordance session is ever mistranscribed. It is not a glamorous role. My species did not evolve to fight. We evolved to witness accurately, which, as it turns out, is a much stranger and more dangerous skill than anyone gives it credit for. I did not know that yet on the Tuesday I'm telling you about. None of us did. Threshold Accord Station sits in neutral space between 4 major trade corridors, built in the old ring and spoke style favored by the Solmeric Compact a few centuries back, when they still built most things that mattered. The gallery I work in, Concordance Chamber 7, smells faintly of ozone and cold stone polish, and the light is always a few degrees too blue for comfort, which the station engineers insist is optimal for cross-species visual parity, and which everyone privately agrees is optimal for nothing except headaches. My job on petition days is simple. I sit in the recorder's alcove 12 meters back from the petitioner's floor, and I transcribe every word, every pause. My species is uniquely suited to this because we do not editorialize. 4 eyes means 4 independent lines of sight, and something in our physiology refuses to let memory drift from fact. It's not virtue. It's just how we're built. If you ever want to know exactly what was said in a room, ask an Andrai. We cannot help but tell you. That Tuesday's docket had one entry, classification petition, species human homeworld Sol 3 requesting body, United Terran Concordance delegation, subject, full voting status review. I remember thinking it was going to be dull. Most classification petitions are. I was wrong about that too. Presiding over Chamber 7 that day was Senior Adjudicating Envoy Threl Vantho of the Solmeric Compact, a species that discovered faster-than-light travel so long ago that most of the galaxy's current spacefaring civilizations weren't civilizations yet and who have never, not once in my 6 years of transcribing their diplomats, let anyone forget it. Envoy Vantho stood 211 centimeters, luminous, pale gold skin that shifted faintly with his mood, a Solmeric trait that makes them terrible at poker and worse at hiding contempt. He wore the double-rank sash, which technically only ceremonial adjudicators are meant to wear during first-tier petitions, but which he wore to every session regardless, along with a title he insisted, every single time, be used in full. Senior Adjudicating Envoy of the Solmeric Compact, second chair to the Threshold Concordance. 9 words. I had to write all 9, every time he was addressed per transcription protocol. My wrist ached just thinking about that day. His reputation preceded him. Precise, unhurried, and famously unwilling to grant provisional status to any species that couldn't produce a fully documented apex form. A secondary evolutionary adaptation state, usually a war phase or crisis phase biology, that almost every voting species in the concordance can point to somewhere in its record. It is, in Solmeric doctrine, the single cleanest proof that a species has been tested, that somewhere in its history, its biology answered an existential threat and won. Vantho's guiding philosophy, which he stated often and with visible pride, was this: a species that has never needed to become something else has never proven it could, said in his voice low and resonant and entirely certain. It sounded less like a philosophy and more like a verdict already written. Beside me in the recorder's alcove sat Fen Ubrick, of the Bracknell, many-limbed, low to the floor, built from thin, fibrous cartilage that makes almost no sound when they move, except when something is about to go wrong. Bracknell have a strange physiological quirk, an inner ear structure so sensitive to shifts in ambient tension. vocal microstrain, pulse-adjacent subsonics, the tiny sounds a room makes when people start holding their breath, that Fen tends to flinch a full 2 or 3 seconds before anyone consciously understands why. Fen calls it reading the weather. I call it deeply unsettling to sit next to, because by the time Fen's limbs go rigid, something has usually already gone very wrong, and none of the rest of us know it yet. I mention Fen now because you will want to watch for it later. Fen always knew first. They came in 4 minutes late, which on Threshold Station counts as a minor infraction. Envoy Vantho noted it before they'd even reached the floor. There were 3 of them. Dr. Ren Achebe, Human Concordance Delegate and Field Taxonomist, 171 centimeters, unremarkable build, plain gray delegation uniform with no ornamentation beyond a single rank bar. Sergeant Petra Doyle, Delegation Security Attaché, 168 centimeters, standing slightly behind and to the left of Achebe, in a posture I'd later learn was called Overwatch, saying nothing, her eyes doing a slow, methodical sweep of the room that never seemed to stop moving. And Iyer Voss, Junior Delegation Records Officer, carrying a data slate against his chest like it was something precious, young-faced, visibly the most nervous of the 3, though he hid it well. No claws, no natural plating, no visible weapon, no ceremonial anything. By galactic standard, humans are almost aggressively unremarkable to look at. Soft-skinned, single-hearted, no venom glands, no exoskeleton, nothing on the standard threat index checklist that would make a xenobiologist glance twice. "You are late," Envoy Vantho said, before Achebe had even reached the podium mark. His pale gold skin brightened slightly. Irritation, I noted, transcribing it as minor luminance shift consistent with displeasure. "We are," Achebe agreed. Her voice was flat, unhurried, entirely without apology or defensiveness. "Station transit routing had us behind a compact diplomatic convoy. We didn't think it wise to overtake it. It was such a small thing." But I watched Vantho's skin dim back down, caught slightly off guard by an answer that gave him nothing to push against. Doyle's eyes never stopped moving. Voss adjusted his grip on the slate. I did not know yet that this was the entire shape of what was coming. A species that simply declined to give you the reaction you were fishing for, over and over, until the fishing itself became the story. Envoy Vantho did not waste time. A holographic display bloomed above the petitioner's floor. Comparison charts, 3 columns, humanities data set on the left, a composite, typical voting species baseline in the center, and the Solmeric Compact's own historical record on the right, presented, I noted, entirely unprompted and unnecessary to the metric, but visually persuasive. "Let us begin," Vantho said, "with the metric that matters most in any classification review, documented apex form." He gestured, and a cascade of biological schematics unfolded, species after species, their war phase or crisis phase adaptations logged in exhaustive, luminous detail. The Threxel developed dermal plating under sustained predation pressure 11,000 years ago. The Koruvel developed neural burst state under orbital bombardment during their first contact war. Even my own species, he added, not without a note of pride, carries a documented latent metabolic acceleration state from our early stellar drift period, though it has not been triggered in recorded history. Every voting species in this concordance, he said, and here his voice dropped into something almost gentle, almost sympathetic, has, somewhere in its record, proof that it was tested. He turned to the human column. It was by comparison sparse. Humanity's biological record shows a single baseline physiology, unchanged, for its entire recorded evolutionary history. No secondary adaptation state, no crisis phase biology, no apex form, documented or theorized. He let that sit. 3 metrics, Delegate Achebe, by which this concordance measures a species' readiness for full voting status, tested resilience, adaptive proof, and demonstrated cost. Your species offers evidence of none of them. You have simply, and here he allowed himself the smallest, most practiced smile I had ever transcribed a note about, never needed to become anything else. which raises the honest question of whether you have ever been tested at all, or whether your species' considerable reputation is, as I suspect, largely folklore dressed as fact. Somewhere in the gallery, a Threxil delegate made a low sound that might have been a laugh. I want you to remember one specific thing Vantho said in that speech, because it will matter later. And he said it so casually he clearly believed it was unimportant. A documented latent metabolic acceleration state from our early stellar drift period, though it has not been triggered in recorded history. He was proud of a thing he had never had to use. He did not yet understand what that pride was about to cost him. Achebe didn't answer right away. She reached up, unhurried, almost absent, and pushed back the sleeve of her uniform to rest her forearm on the podium rail. There was a scar there, old, pale, a long, clean line across the inside of her forearm, the kind that doesn't happen by accident and doesn't happen without someone very calm doing very careful work, under very bad conditions. It meant nothing to me at first, just a mark on human skin. But beside me, Fen went rigid, all 11 limbs, simultaneously still, the way water goes still right before something breaks the surface. And across the chamber, I watched Sergeant Doyle's jaw tighten a fraction of a centimeter, the first change of expression she'd shown all session, and Iyer Voss's hand drift, just slightly toward the data slate at his chest, as if he already knew what was about to be asked for. Nobody explained anything. Nobody said a word about the scar. The lecture simply continued for another few seconds, Vantho's voice still smooth, still certain, while 3/4 of the room that actually understood what it was looking at went very quiet, very fast. "Vel," Fen breathed, barely audible even to me, sitting a half-meter away. "That's a surgical scar, field surgical, no anesthetic bloom pattern." So that means someone did it fast and awake and it worked." Fen's voice dropped further. "Do you know what percentage of species in this concordance have a recorded case of successful improvised field surgery performed by the patient's own species, on itself, without their standard medical infrastructure?" I didn't know the number. "Neither do I," Fen said. "That's the point. Nobody's ever needed one." "Envoy Vantho," Achebe said, once he'd finished, her tone exactly as flat as it had been at the door. "I'd like to address 3 points in your assessment if the chamber will permit." Vantho gestured, magnanimous, clearly expecting nothing that would trouble him. "By all means." "First, your comparison baseline for typical voting species draws its predation pressure and crisis phase data from each species' own homeworld environmental history. Humanity's homeworld predation pressure was, by your own registry's numbers, moderate. Nothing that would have forced a secondary adaptation state. You're not measuring whether we were tested. You're measuring whether our planet tested us. Those aren't the same question." A pause. Vantho's skin didn't shift, not yet, but I noted the faint stiffening of his posture. Subject: increased postural rigidity, unclear cause. "Second," Achebe continued, "your apex form metric assumes the adaptation shows up in the biological record, dermal plating, neural burst states, metabolic shifts. But an adaptation doesn't have to be biological to be tested and proven. You measured our bodies. You didn't measure what we built, or what we did with what we had instead of a second body plan." "That is not how the metric is defined," Vantho said, and for the first time there was an edge in it. "I know," Achebe said. "That's my second point. Third," and here she paused, glanced down at the scar on her own arm as though only just noticing it was showing and did not cover it back up. "You used the word folklore to describe our reputation. I'd like to correct that if I may. Folklore is a story a species tells about itself that isn't backed by evidence. What you're describing, a reputation built entirely from documented, cited, cross-verified incident reports, isn't folklore. The correct term is precedent. I'd ask the chamber record reflect that distinction, because it isn't a small one. I wrote that down word for word. I remember my own hand feeling strange doing it, like I was recording something being built, not something being said. Vantho's luminous skin had gone a shade duller than I'd ever transcribed a note about before. "Precedent," he repeated, "requires citation." "It does," Achebe said. "We have it. Tell me then, Vantho said, recovering some of his composure, sharpening it into a challenge. Tell this chamber about the incident that Scar came from. If it's precedent and not folklore, it should hold up to direct account. Achebe didn't hesitate. She spoke the way I imagine a report gets read into a permanent record. Flat, exact, no rise or fall for effect. 11 years, 4 months ago, Survey Outpost, Moon Designation Callus Theta 9, 3-person science team, myself included. Hull breach, secondary decompression event, during a seismic shift the outpost's engineers hadn't modeled for. I was 31 years old. Pressure hull failure exposed a laceration to my forearm consistent with the scar visible now, roughly 9 centimeters, arterial proximity moderate. Medical bay was on the compromised side of the breach, inaccessible for an estimated 40 minutes given decompression protocols. Team physician was unconscious from a separate injury sustained in the same event. She said this the way someone reads a grocery list. I had to remind myself twice to keep transcribing, because some smaller part of me kept waiting for her voice to change and it simply never did. I closed the wound myself using a suture kit rated for training simulations, not live field use, because it was what was in reach. No anesthetic. The kit's anesthetic vial had cracked in the same decompression event. Total closure time, 19 minutes, working left-handed on my own right forearm, while monitoring cabin pressure readouts to know when it was safe to move the team physician to stable air. We were recovered by a relief shuttle 6 hours later. All 3 of us survived. A beat. I'd note for the record that the training kit sutures held better than expected. I've recommended them for field-rated certification since. The recommendation is still pending review if the chamber finds that detail relevant. Somewhere in the gallery, someone made a small, strangled sound. That was the dry humor Fen had warned me humans sometimes carried into the worst moments. Not a joke, exactly. Just an inability to let even their own worst hour go without one precise, almost bureaucratic observation tucked in at the end. The sutures held better than expected. I have thought about that line more times than I can count since. If I may, Sergeant Doyle said, stepping forward for the first time. Her voice, when it finally came, was even flatter than Achebe's had been. I'll add a second account, unprompted, for the chamber's consideration of precedent versus folklore. Vantho, visibly off balance now, only nodded. Border skirmish, perimeter station, Kessel Row, 7 years prior to this session. I was the only conscious combat-trained individual in my unit following an ambush that left 4 wounded and 1 already dead. I do not have a scar to show you. What I have is a decision log. She nodded once to Voss. Voss stepped up beside her and for the first time all session spoke. His voice cracked slightly on the first word, then steadied. Reference designation KR 1147 Delta, cross-filed with the Terran Concordance Archive and independently verified by 2 neutral third-party observer states at the time. I can produce the citation number now, if the chamber wishes it entered into record. Enter it, Vantho said, and his voice had lost most of its resonance. KR 1147 Delta, Voss said again, clear and precise, and I watched half the chamber quietly write it down. The way you write down something you suspect you'll want to check yourself later, alone, without an audience. That's 2, Achebe said, calm as ever. There is a third, if the chamber wants it, but I'd rather it not be mine or Sergeant Doyle's. I'd rather it be the Concordance's own archive. Ask your registry envoy. How many separate, independently verified incident reports exist across our species' recorded contact history, cross-filed under crisis response, field medicine, or unassisted survival? The number is public. It has been public the entire time your species has been assembling this classification metric. Vantho did not ask his registry. He didn't need to. I watched him understand in real time that the number was already sitting somewhere behind him, in a system he had simply never queried, because it had never occurred to him that it might matter. Envoy Vantho, Achebe said, gently now, and this, I think, was the moment the entire session actually turned, quieter than anything before it. May I ask you a question, for the record? He straightened. You may. Your species' own doctrine holds that a documented apex form is proof a species has been tested and has proven it could become something else when survival demanded it. You mentioned your own species carries a latent metabolic acceleration state, documented but in your words never triggered in recorded history. That is correct. Then I'd like to ask the chamber to consider a simple definitional question, and I'd like it entered into record exactly as I phrase it. How does the concordance define species for purposes of this metric? By what a population is capable of, on paper, in theory, or by what it has actually provably done when the choice was made for it rather than by it? The chamber was silent. Because if it's the former, Achebe continued, then congratulations, envoy. Your species has an excellent paper record, and so, I'd imagine, does mine, somewhere, in genes none of us have ever needed to read. But if it's the latter, if species means what a population actually does under real and unchosen pressure and can show its work for, then I'd ask, respectfully, and only for the record, what is your species' equivalent citation? Not the schematic, the incident number. Vantho did not answer immediately. Take your time, Achebe said, and there was nothing cruel in it. If anything, I would say, and I have thought about this a great deal since, there was something almost kind in how plainly she said it. It's a fair question. It's the same one you asked us. The silence stretched long enough that I began, out of habit, to note its duration for the transcript, the way protocol requires for any pause exceeding 15 seconds. I stopped at 11, because I didn't think a number was going to capture it. Envoy Vantho's luminous skin, which had brightened and dimmed all session with every shift of his composure, went almost entirely flat. Not dark, not bright, just still, the way I imagine it goes when a Salmeric has nothing left underneath the light to show. He straightened his double-rank sash, a small, unconscious gesture. The kind people make when they need their hands to do something ordinary, while the rest of them catches up. This chamber, he said, and his voice had lost its resonance entirely, gone thin and procedural, will recess the remainder of today's docket, citing an administrative scheduling conflict with tomorrow's perimeter accord session. There was no scheduling conflict with tomorrow's perimeter accord session. I checked the docket myself twice out of habit, because my species cannot help but verify things. There was nothing there at all. He did not storm out. He did not raise his voice, not once the entire session. He simply gathered the small tablet he'd used to project his charts, said the closing procedural phrase required to formally end a session, 9 words, which I transcribed exactly because it is my job, and left the chamber floor at an unhurried, deliberate pace that fooled absolutely no one. He hadn't lost to an argument. I want to be precise about that because precision is the only thing my species is actually good for. He had lost to a data point he'd stated proudly, out loud on the permanent record, 20 minutes earlier, about a power his own species had never once had to use. Set gently, without malice, next to a citation number a young records officer had rattled off from memory. He lost to a Tuesday, to a footnote, to an honest question he had no honest answer for. The Threxil delegate who had laughed earlier, I never learned her name, only her seat designation, Gallery 3, Seat 11, approached the human delegation before they'd even finished packing their materials. She stood a moment, visibly recalibrating something behind her eyes before she spoke. That scar, she said to Achebe, quieter than her earlier laugh had been. You did that yourself, while conscious. I did, Achebe said. No pride in it, no performance. Why? The Threxil delegate asked, and I could hear in the shape of the question that she wasn't asking about the surgery. She was asking about all of it. The scar, the citation number, the flat, unhurried way none of them had once tried to make themselves sound impressive. Achebe considered the question honestly, the way I'd watched her consider everything else that day. Because the alternative, she said, was worse. That's the whole reason for most of it, if I'm honest. We didn't become anything else because we wanted to prove a point to a concordance committee 11 years before we'd even applied for one. We did it because the moon's crust shifted and the medical bay was on the wrong side of a door. I have thought about that session more than almost anything else I've transcribed in 6 years, and here is what I've come to understand. For whatever an Andrei's understanding is worth, every species in this concordance carries some proof of what it can survive. The Threxel have their dermal plating, the Coruvel have their neural burst state. My own species, if you're curious, has nothing at all on file. We never needed it, and I used to think that made us the least interesting entry in the whole registry. A footnote species. Recorders, not survivors. But watching that session, I understood something I hadn't before. Humanity's reputation in this galaxy isn't a myth, and it isn't a threat either. Not really. Not the way Envoy Vantho seemed braced to hear it. It's closer to a warning label, written in the driest, most procedural language imaginable, by a species that seems constitutionally unable to tell a story about itself without a citation number attached. We were tested, and here is exactly, precisely, unglamorously how. Because we are the kind of species that writes it down afterward instead of letting it become legend. That is a stranger thing to sit across a table from than any apex form. A dermal plate is frightening because of what it might do. A citation number is frightening because it already happened, to a specific person, on a specific date, and they filed the paperwork afterward instead of telling anyone how they felt about it. I don't think Envoy Vantho left that chamber believing humanity was dangerous. I think he left believing something quieter and worse, that his species had simply never had to find out what they were, and that not knowing was no longer something he could be proud of out loud, in a room with people who did know and had the incident number to prove it. I still have my transcript of that session, every word of it filed under my own recorder's seal. And sometimes, when a new delegation comes through Chamber 7 certain of its own numbers, I find myself watching their sleeves, waiting to see whether anyone in the room is quietly, unglamorously wearing the answer already, on their skin, and simply hasn't been asked the right question yet.